Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you may be across our lovely planet. Time zones are slightly challenging this week and next week. It's 10 a.m. Pacific time in the US, but for the large chunks of the world, it's an hour different. Sometimes someone's ever going to standardize on time zones, but yeah, that's what it is. Sorry for the slight delay as well. Technical gremlins, but what you can do there, it's all just computers anyway. But thanks so much for joining us here live anyway. We really appreciate you joining us on Serverless Office Hours, which we're on the AWS Twitch channel. We're on YouTube Serverless Land and also via LinkedIn Live. My name's Julian Wood. I'm a developer advocate for serverless at AWS, and I'm joined by a gaggle of Belfastians. I don't know how would you say it. Gaggle probably sounds the wrong kind of word. We've basically got Dave Anderson, Mark McCann, and Michael O'Reilly, who are all architects at GP, which is short for Globalization Partners. And we're going to be talking some really cool stuff all about being successful at Serverless today. So welcome all three, first times on Serverless Office Hours. Met all of you again last week at the Belfast Serverless Days. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us, Julian.
Thanks, Julian. Thanks for
Thank you. Great to be here.
Absolutely. Well, we'll head on to what we're going to be talking about shortly, but just looking back over the past week of the world of serverless here at AWS. If you're a Python developer, Ran Eisenberg, who is a community builder, has a really great getting started project with Python. And although I say it's getting started, it's the scaffolding to really build a fully functional, well-architected Python application with all the observability and all the cool things built in the scaffolding and CI/CD pipelines and everything. Really a huge amount of effort that Ran has put into this. So if you look on the Serverless Land YouTube channel, last week's stream, and you can watch. Really great for, and I suppose not just Python, although the code is all Python, but you can imagine a lot of the observability and a lot of the metrics and everything generated out of that could be useful for other languages as well. In terms of what's new for serverless, just a smallish thing from DynamoDB now has got table deletion protection. So anything that is stateful, often those are the challenging things with any IT architectures, just somehow makes it easier not to delete those. And then, yeah, Kinesis has got some new things coming on, and especially data delivery to Elastic. So one of these better integrations that you don't have to now write your own code to take things from Kinesis into other services. So that is all cool from Elastic. In terms of compute blog posts, if you're doing WebSockets API with API Gateway, Alexi has anonymous users, a whole post on a really good architecture for that. And Mehmet, Stephen, and Maximilian also have a really cool post all about using SAM CLI to build Java applications. So Java is obviously huge with serverless, really good with Lambda, especially with all the cold start optimizations and cool little new toys that you can use. And so this is a really good way to be able to use infrastructure as code with Java and use the SAM CLI for your sort of debug and test and building process. So that's the past week. But this week we are talking succeeding with serverless, which may sound as a bit of a strangely oddish title, but basically, I have three experts in our virtual room over here who've been working with serverless for a number of years, have built a serverless practice, and have written actually the book or one of the books on how to succeed with serverless in your organization, why it's important, and everything. So I'm going to stick their information in the chat shortly. But Michael, Mark, Dave, tell us where do we kick off? How did you start doing things with serverless, and what does it mean, and how did you become successful? Was it you or your org? Paint the picture for us.
Wow, it's a big question. So it's a good question. It probably goes back. Well, first, the three of us were working together with Liberty Mutual for the past kind of load of years. I kind of joined around 2007, and Mark and Mike maybe joined a year or two before that. We were all kind of working similar teams, building kind of software and kind of having good fun working together. The serverless journey probably started in about 2013, 2014. I was CTO in Belfast at the time, and we were starting to kind of move to the cloud with Liberty Mutual. And Liberty Mutual being like like the Fortune 76, one of the top 10 insurance companies in the world. I was lucky enough to be at the table when we were speaking to AWS about the move to public cloud. We had all dabbled in various different parts of cloud before, but that was when it kind of kicked off. And the big thing that I thought of is, how do we build applications in a cloud native way? What's going to change about how we build software? And that was 2014 was when Lambda launched. And then we started this kind of happy journey with probably the three of us and a bunch of other people trying to think about, we had this, or Mark had a very bold statement about, can we make Liberty Mutual a serverless-first enterprise? And we were all kind of stupid enough to say, let's see if we could make that happen. So, I mean, it was a fantastic journey. I'll let the guys chip in, but we tried a bunch of different things about how do we create the right environment to enable people to go fast? How do we create the right tools, enable them? How do we ensure there's really good architectural quality? And how do we really clear on the purpose about what we're trying to do? And none of us wanted to come to work to write code. We wanted to come to work to solve business problems. So it's not really that we went out looking for serverless. Serverless kind of found us. And then we can get to the book in a second, but we ended up kind of documenting our kind of playbook. So I don't know, Mark, Mike, if anything you want to add to that kind of long-winded intro.
Yeah, I think from when I graduated in 2000 all the way through to when we started working together, there's always been that continuous passion for learning and improvement and modernization and trying to evolve from mainframes and traditional stacks to the cloud, to even 12-factor apps and Spring, and even the adoption of Java and JavaScript. So we were always in this sort of consistently trying to improve and modernize and in an incremental and iterative way. So then whenever serverless came along, it was like, this is a big evolutionary step for us. We can really use this to accelerate even further. And we mentioned it a lot in the book, but create that environment for high-performing teams delivering rapid business value. It was another one of those things that just fitted into the way we were working, and it really helped unlock a lot of the things that we were struggling with the traditional sort of ways of working.
Yeah, I mean,
We're going to have Mike.
No, I was just going to add in that, Dave. Even I think way back, even before kind of serverless, the term was coined, and we were always kind of trying to, I think we've always been kind of focused in terms of our approaches in limiting cognitive burden on teams and trying to kind of deal with operational toil. To Mark's point, how do we get something out to production fast in front of users? Getting feedback, and I think, with Agile, we started to look at sort of different flavors of that, and it was all about getting out in front of customers, experimentation, stuff like that. And we almost became experts in identifying those inertia points within the existing org. So it almost felt like serverless was fairly natural to us whenever it arrived. We could, because we were of that way of thinking, once these concepts started to arrive, they almost felt like eureka type things. They were really sort of intrigued us a wee bit, I think.
But now all three of you have sort of moved onto GP, and so taking those learnings from where you've worked in an enterprise where you sort of built a whole lot of these practices to somewhere new, has that been a challenge, or has that been interesting? Because obviously organizations are very different, or are they very different? So tell us about GP and how and the sort of the new part that you're trying to do this, I suppose, all again or in a different way. I suppose my question is also people approaching this and they see other kind of companies be successful in serverless, and we've got Liberty Wood you worked for before, and amazing companies like Lego and Dunelm, and a whole bunch of companies and Capital One who've done amazing things with serverless. Some people may think, well, that's not for us. Yeah. What did you say?
I think that's a great question. I mean, we had years in Liberty to try and figure this out and see what worked. So we had a good probably maybe 8 years working at this, and then we paused to write the book, and now we're almost like going again in a brand new company, and that's really interesting because a lot of the muscle memory you thought you had or didn't have, it's a different environment. So I think it's really interesting to see if the same approaches work, and GP is a very sort of interesting prospect as well. I know, Mark, you've kind of thought you're probably thinking more about
it's actually very
sort of goal.
Yeah, it's very aligned to the serverless sort of journey as well. So GPR mission is really to break down barriers to global business and really enable employment opportunities for everybody everywhere. And so we want to really unleash human potential. That's very similar to what has happened with the advent of serverless and cloud computing, right? It has really democratized a lot of opportunities for people around the world. So there's a good alignment there between what we're trying to accomplish in GP and what the serverless sort of promise has been for organizations, right? Removing those barriers, removing friction, enabling opportunities, and democratizing this globally, right? So it's very lot of synergies when we're talking about serverless in GP. You can actually use a lot of the talking points that we've used to convince people that they adopt serverless as well.
Yeah, and I think it'd be fair to say, we wrote the book. So we've been, writing the book sometimes is interesting because now you've got to live by what you do in the book, and so a lot of what we talk about in there in terms of, the flywheel and, understanding our North Stars, understanding what's important. We were applying, those techniques. We're getting into, the challenge, and we leverage a lot of that in there, and again, a lot of it's kind of just good engineering kind of rigor and discipline that that we try and set for our squads and make sure our teams are on that trajectory. So I think you can apply what organizations are all kind of fairly unique in terms of what they're trying to do, but ultimately what we're finding is the same kind of processes, the same kind of way to evolve it. Creating that flywheel within organizations is a good pathway to take. And we're certainly trying to apply that in everything that we're doing at the minute, in these organizations.
Yeah, so you may realize just from what we're chatting about that there's actually a book to back all of this up. And there, I can hold that. The Value Flywheel Effect by, there we go, David Anderson and Mark McCann and Michael O'Reilly. Oh, there we go. And yeah, this is literally I wouldn't say a prescriptive manual, but it's a really good way that takes a whole lot of different threads of how we build organizations and how we can evolve organizations and how we can understand what our users need and want and what we can build for them. And it's all distilled in a really good book. And I'll say I flick through a lot of books that come across my my desk and whatever my lap while I'm reading on various IT technologies and this kind of thing. But this has been really engaging and interesting. So I'm putting the link in the chat as well. And I don't often recommend books because a lot of them can be very niche and can be very sort of pointy. But I think if you're wanting to accelerate your business and really take effectively use the cloud, this book is really going to be super useful for that. And the stories are, I think, quite universal. And I mention stories in a deliberate term because a lot of the practical information in the book has really simple to understand stories that back them all up. And they not these sort of arcane technical, or what if this happens or what if that happens, really just simple stories that make a lot of sense, and some really good case studies from even places like the BBC and WorkGrid Software, and anyone who learned a lot about the cloud and early serverless things often used a cloud guru. Really good messages from them about how they've done it. So where does one start? You've obviously written a book, so maybe my first thing is to say, well, go and buy the book or get the book, and this is going to help you. But who is this aimed for? Sort of enterprises or big companies to take advantage of the cloud, or what is the sort of 1 or 2 centimeter pitch if someone's listening, going, is this relevant to me?
Well, I think we certainly seen lots is a lot of people would migrate to the cloud. And like I was kind of the squeaky wheel in Liberty, because we'd be talking about migration, and I'd be like, but hang on a second, it's not that we just moved. We need to modernize. How do we make things different? So for me, it's about, I'm not going to say it's for CTOs or CIOs, whatever. It's for people who want to drive change in your organization, including business leaders, regardless of your title. If you want to drive change, there's a different way to work in the cloud. And we've been using the phrase modern cloud, because it's not using your traditional techniques on a different data center. It's actually rapidly changing how you work. And that's really what we started with. How do we join the technology and business strategy so it's a single strategy that the cloud powers that kind of journey? And we get a really funny review on, I think it was Goodreads. It says, you don't need to be technical to read this book. I mean, even a business person could read it. And you're like, yeah, that's the point. we could have wrote a very technical book, but that wasn't the intent. You know what I mean? It's really because for us, we've found this certain shape of work, and how do we try and describe that in a very accessible way, with pointing out to things that influenced us, tying things together, joining the dots, trying to help people with myths, practices, techniques, and even case studies. They try and kind of summarize everything up and codify a technique, which we call the Value Flywheel Effect, because it is a flywheel. Sheen Brasilis from Lego has this great saying: is once you go serverless, it's like a rocket ship. You can't get off and say, okay, we're done now. You know, that acceleration, the value never stops.
Yeah, so I suppose back on your original point about the Goodreads comment is that I suppose there are two sides of it. Technology is always about people in a way. Yes, it's the technology side, but there's people from two aspects of it from I can think. One is your customers are generally all people. So understanding what your customers need and what you want to build for them, they are the people. And then you are people building things for your customers. And I think any organization that I've worked in before, which has sometimes been an underperforming in my view, and not to cast aspersions on anywhere I've worked for before, but I think lots of people will resonate with sort of underperforming IT organizations who may be very busy but just don't seem to be doing the right kind of thing. And I think we're a people-driven business, and people want to build things, people want to do cool things at work, and ultimately create cool new things for their customers. So yeah, I like the sort of socio-technical part of this, that we sort of reimagining how people can work and using the cloud as an enabler.
Yeah, totally. So we're probably going. Maybe I can share something, because we can maybe
go
through
certainly.
The flywheel itself. Let me see if I can
and
share
while Dave is bringing that up as well, remember, because we are obviously live, send us your questions and your questions and your comments via the chat on the various platforms, and we'll bring them up and we can answer them as best as we can. I appreciate this is also, we're not going to the depths of Python as last week's, but yeah, this is really got some really three great brains to pick about enabling serverless for your organization. So yeah, so this Dave, you were talking about the value flywheel, and so is this the flywheel? And I suppose, just to reiterate, a flywheel is something that goes fast and gets faster and faster and faster.
Yes, that's true. Exactly. I got a great question about a year ago from someone saying, "Is it not just like a sequence, like boom, 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 you're done?" And it's like, no, the flywheel keeps speeding up. It's not that you go around this once. It's that this is constant. So, and for me, the analogy that means is you want to build momentum, and you're looking for inertia points. To take those away, that will slow you down. So you removing barriers, making things more accessible, enablement to kind of speed up. So really, and it was the process of writing the book that we really codified this. And again, talk about the goal is to join those business and technology strategies. And there's kind of 4 phases. You start with clarity of purpose. If you're sitting doing a piece of work, why are we doing it? Like, what's the North Star? And one good thing to measure is time to value. If someone has a business goal in mind, do you really understand that? Do you have good metrics, or is there alignment? And we've been using the North Star framework to kind of help us really lay that out. So that's that first thing about being really clear about clarity of purpose, and your entire team should understand that and wider. The next is challenge. Do you have the environment to challenge that clarity of purpose? Can we ask questions about it? Is this like a death march, or can we say, well, hang on a second, why are we doing that? So you want to create that environment for success, where the team feel empowered to speak up, probe things, ask questions, build understanding, maybe spot issues that might be early. That's all part of that challenge, because when the rubber hits the road and you start to build, you can't be too prescriptive for the engineers. You got to unleash them and let people build. The third phase is next best action. So this is really where Serverless-First comes in, and having that really strong developer experience. If you have the teams fully set up, I would say with AWS as your platform team, effectively, with everything kind of unleashed, teams will build exceptionally quickly. And we can go into that in a second. And then the fourth is long-term value, where you get in this mindset of problem prevention, and we use the well-architected framework to make sure we're building for long-term value and growth. And one of the techniques we use, which we can touch on in a second, is wordly mapping. So wordly mapping is kind of our secret sauce behind all this, and it's how we sort of pretty much figure out what direction we go in and what we build versus what we don't build. And that's probably the most interesting technique of all this, but we find it really interesting to kind of almost frame the work in these kind of 4 phases of the flywheel.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the first part I picked up, and we'll even sort of go around it. Clarity of purpose obviously is, you need to know what you're doing, you need to know what your goals are. And I understand a lot of IT organizations, a lot of that clarity of purpose is something internal, but this clarity of purpose is where your business is actually going to. What are your customers needing to buy? How are you going to make revenue? How are you how are you as a business going to go forward? And again, the socio-technological thing of getting even your developers and your architects and your builders to understand the company vision, so they're building towards that vision, must be super useful. And I think the challenge is that a lot about sort of also enabling people lower down the organization to make decisions, to be empowered, to, I suppose, challenge is the word you've mentioned over there, but it's also just bubbling up their ideas. And instead of having a sort of command and control structure, this is sort of pushing out decision making further in your organization.
Absolutely. I mean, it's very bound to the first one, like the sense of purpose. With like one of the things around sociotechnical is there's two types of things that drive people, by function or by purpose. If it's by purpose, you want people the space to challenge the thinking. It's not challenges we're going to have a fight. It's challenging. I'm raising a question. That's so important that you create that environment where people can ask questions and just really get under the skin of what we're trying to do and what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I think in a friendly way, you should be able to ask your team, tell me what you're working on. What metric is it trying to influence? And then how does it help us realize our North Star? And that should go all the way up the chain, right? You should be able to relate the things that you're doing in your team day and daily with your actual North Star for your division, your area, your organization.
Yeah, a critical component of fast flow is building the right thing, isn't it? And understanding what you're going after.
I think for me, the big thing is, I think there's one thing looking at serverless technologies and like trying to put a Lambda together or maybe using something like EventBridge. That's brilliant. It's the second thing, trying to get that working in your team. If there's 6 or 7 of you, trying to all get on the same page. Like, we've been scaling this through a huge amount of teams. Do you know what I mean? So trying to get lots and lots of teams thinking the same way, and sometimes you don't even know what a team's doing. So trying to create something that will scale across a large organization, it's much more socio-technical than just giving people a tool.
Yeah, like some of the first things that Mike did in the current org is we just get a team familiar with this stuff, get a team up and running, get something delivered. That gets the flywheel turning, right? Get some value into the hands of your users, your customers, and then that builds momentum, that builds success, that builds some of the pathways to production, right? And then you can start to then share those lessons. You can start to bring in some of the well-architected stuff. You can start to harden the solutions, and then you can scale the teams, right? Nothing beats seeing a successful team delivering value to a customer to get other teams interested in adopting the same practices and ways of working.
So doing this again, Mike, then you are sort of enabling a new cohort of developers, and they are maybe seeing serverless for the first time. I know GP is quite a more advanced organization, so some people may have done serverless, but some may have not. What are the kind of sort of questions and things that would help other people to sort of get over the the speed bump of understanding what this is all about?
Yeah, so as Mark said, I think we would always kind of recommend with just starting with something simple. So I'm a big fan of the mitosis pattern in terms of how we build teams. You always start with the one squad, and the one squad will lead the charge, and then from the one squad you can then sort of work on sort of populating the skills out, and you can build up that experience reasonably quickly. I think the challenge part is super important, because I think the challenge part here is there's never a straight line. So as Dave talks about like the modernization and moving to cloud and adopting kind of serverless first, challenge is really about how do we make the case. So we could focus on one particular part of a system, but challenge sometimes we would need to invest some time somewhere else. And that may be that we need to invest time building up skills, or we need to kind of modernize a particular service to enable another part of the system. But in large part, it's just getting teams familiar, getting them hands-on. We talk about, Dave mentioned at the start of the call as well, like just talking about some of the myths and and kind of working with teams through some of those as well. But a lot of it is, a lot of what we try to do here with the flywheel is build in sustainability into teams. So as we work our way through the flywheel, it's making sure teams are, this is where well architected and things like that are so important, is making sure teams understand that, there's a lot of responsibility on their shoulders. Serverless development is not necessarily straightforward. And, there's certain kind of there's certain things we got to do to make sure that, you know, we're looking after the organization, but two, you know, we're building things in a well engineered, well architected fashion. And it's that to me is an iterative process. So I always kind of feel it's always good to start in something small and kind of, you know, work it out from there.
So what would be an example of one of those hurdles that people find it difficult to understand, or it's new, and how would somebody sort of jump that gap, other than bringing in you as an expert to to help them on their way?
No, it's a good one. So types of things would be just around, you know, patterns, stuff like that. You know, so certain teams would kind of build certain things, say like edged optimized API. You know, so there's a lot that kind of goes into how do we surface like an endpoint that sits externally, and what's a way to do that? You know, I always kind of find that without things like the well-architected framework or going at that, there's always a conversation there to be had around, well, are we in behind a, you know, like a CloudFront distribution? You know, have we applied the security controls at that level? Have we good instrumentation telemetry in relation to how this thing's behaving? You know, like, so I kind of feel like there's you know, once we get the team onto this journey, getting them into those well architected reviews and the habit of it, and then continuously just checking back with where we're at, you know, and making sure that they buy into that way of working.
I think there's nothing beats getting them into like a sandbox environment and actually, you know, using SAM or CDK or something, just building something and deploying something in an environment that's not going anywhere, just to demystify some of that stuff and just to get them on with, hey, here's how I can build, here's how I can deploy, here's how I can
So I suppose, having those, because serverless is far less infrastructure to look after and manage, you can, in a really little scaffolding, being at CDK or SAM or serverless framework or Terraform or even Pulumi, you can get some applications up and running, or at least even a little pattern up and running really quickly, and show somebody who isn't affair with serverless, well, this is all you had to create to build that.
And that feedback loop's critical, right? Once they get that feedback loop turning, you get the flywheel turning effectively, right? Then they get more confidence that, oh yeah, I can actually do this. I can bring this into my squad. I can deliver value with this.
Yeah, and there's a lot there you can kind of go out. There is a lot of tooling out there that does support it. You know, like one of the first things I remember bringing in was an opinionated CFN, that tool called CFN NAG, where it'll scan your cloud formation and give you like an opinionated feedback on the configuration of your cloud formation, and you know, and even setting that off and just a wee bit of rigor around that, and forcing teams to, you know, address that feedback. You know, it's easy done up front, but it certainly, you know, that's where we get into this long-term value concept. It's just good habits. Getting teams into those things early on is definitely a big enabler.
And I think you see some of this in the chat about the value, right? How do you make sure you're delivering value? And a lot of that.
So thanks, TechBot, for joining us there. Yeah, there's the question. How do you ensure the projects you're actually spending time and on effort deliver value?
Yeah, and a lot of that comes from understanding who your users are and what their needs are, and then making sure that you have good data and good metrics around what value are you currently delivering, what's your baseline for today, and what are you trying to improve, what are you trying to get to, right? So you want to be able to tie the work that you're doing back to North Star and clarity of purpose. There should be metrics, KPIs, you know, dollar amounts, what, you know, business, you know, impact that you should be able to quantify as part of that phase. And then the work that you do in your team should be to influence one of those key indicators or key metrics, right? So that means that you're always delivering value, and you're able to have a good conversation around, you know, is this valuable? Is the work that I'm doing worth it? And then you can service that up to the business about, okay, we've done this. What do we want to do next? Right? What's the next most valuable thing we can do as a team?
Okay, so you mentioned it earlier about the Wardley mapping, and I know there's a lot to Wardley mapping, but it's a really sort of visual way to be able to show a value chain, and, you know, in a way connect all the behind the scenes components up to exactly what you are actually building for your users. Do you actually have an example of what one would look like? I can pull one. I'm now putting you on the spot. I don't know what's in your slides.
No, I've got one here.
So I know this is super useful, and it, you know, something that as I know helped a lot of people just to be able to visualize that sort of user needs based on the previous question of how do you know what you're delivering value.
There's a nice one. There's another neat thing about what we call some of the attributes of a serverless first team, like, but I think that this was a really interesting map here, which let me just make that a bit bigger, which I thought was, this was a really, I would say, important map as we started into this journey. And Wardley mapping, for anyone who hasn't heard of it, there's a researcher in the UK called Simon Wardley, and he was in a CEO position about maybe 15 years ago, when he realized a lot of the strategy didn't make sense. So he came up with this way of kind of Wardley mapping, of kind of mapping out a value chain. So where you would kind of, the way you read these is, you start with a kind of the anchor at the top, which is your value chain, and it kind of goes down here, and it's kind of this needs this, and these depend on as they go down the chain. And then you look at the evolution of the components from left to right, where Genesis is something that's kind of brand new, and you know, it's never been done. Custom is something you kind of know how to build, but you're still not quite sure. Product is there's high customer demand for this, and commodity is like the cost of doing business. And this was a really important map that we had used a lot. As you can see, the evolution of things like high MTTR moves you to cloud, and kind of some of your kind of good architectural practices like DevOps kind of move away from kind of that kind of legacy ones. Your operating system starts to move, your cloud strategy moves to serverless, and really get to the point where there's some emerging practices you can start to look at. And really the thing about this map, which is interesting from the user need, anything below this line is kind of is less visible to the kind of consumers up here, because it's kind of interesting. You can look at your stack and say, how would I move certain components across and get to the value that I need to build? So it's a really interesting technique, and we've used this a lot to try and sort of decide when we're modernizing, what components do we need to move and what do we not need to move.
So partly it's a visualization technique to be able to visualize the components of your stack. And you know, and this example starts with an application, but it could be a particular user, you know, an external user. So this is sort of built for external users, and an external user, you know, maybe accessing your website, or may need to make a payment, or this kind of thing. And then you sort of note down all the sort of the enabling things that help that happen. So, you know, a website would need a platform to run on, and would need some sort of code, and would maybe need a CRM system, or maybe need, I'm thinking off the top of my head here, or maybe needs a payment gateway, all these kind of things. You can sort of map out a bit of your, not necessarily your architecture, but it's a mix of your architecture and your business processes. And then with that sort of realization that things further down the stack are less visible to your user, and so actually you should be consuming them rather than building your own, you know, your own custom authentication system. That's a canonical example of there. Loads of authentication systems. Your user interacts with it only via an API. They don't care over the nuts and bolts of it. And so this isn't something you should build yourself. This is something that you should just consume.
Yeah. 100%. And this is exactly the type of map we would build. You know, so if we were looking at like a particular tech stack, for example, Julian, to your point, it's a great collaboration tool, because the vertical axis here is about visibility, and Dave's saying, you know, if you're having a conversation with, say, a product manager or a designer or whatever, it's very hard for them to understand what goes into putting that thing on a screen or on a phone. That further on down that value chain sometimes is where it needs the investment, you know, and sometimes you've got to, you know, make that case and have that conversation. So these can be a really good, you know, tool for having those sorts of conversation, but, you know, enacting, you know, movement, getting some strategy together to, you know, talk about your cloud strategy, talk about the strategy for your tech stack, talk about where you are losing value, or maybe where there's stuff there that's in custom that is, you know, costing you time and expense and you know, operational expense potentially, and talk about a strategy about how do we move it from left to right there through product out into.
So those are the sort of arrows that there's an evolution of. The first bit is understanding where you currently are in your tech stack, and then if there is an example, for instance, if you have built your own custom authentication system, you know that you want to move it to the right to some sort of product or commodity, and the fact that you can just visually see that on a map can at least highlight to you, we've actually built something which we can now just consume. And so you have visibility of, you know, all the underlying things within your organization. And I think TechBody, you've come back with, you know, common off-the-shelf software and SAF products to the right, so you can get early buy-in from the business around serverless. You then focus on the top left. I suppose that's
It's really, I mean, the shape of the map is really important. That TechBot, exactly spot on. It's not to say the stuff at the bottom is not important, but should you focus all your time on something way down the bottom left that's completely invisible to your customer and custom, are you better getting that capability of an expert like AWS who do this at massive scale and say, well, I'll rent it from this vendor, and then I'll focus on what's a differentiator for my business. We used to always use the example. Teams would say, we're going to save a couple of $1,000 by writing our own login system. And you're like, yeah, that's really interesting. But maybe we should just spend some money on a decent login system and actually write products for our business, because at the end of the year, your president of your business isn't going to say, well done, folks, you saved us $5,000 on not buying that login license. He'll talk about the vast amount of value that either did or didn't realize. So it's really about being very clear what's in that top left, what's the emerging capability that's going to really excite your business, or the top right, the capability you're getting really good at, and making sure there's a decent value chain below where things are in the right place. And just for example, your logging framework should be right over to the right. Just rent that from someone.
Yeah, we did this a lot in our previous organization. We did it today, but just mapping out your tech stack and working with teams to say, here are some opportunities that you can use to evolve from, say, custom built database to Dynamo, from a custom API gateway to AWS API gateway. So it was a really good conversational tool to allow us to have that conversation with teams about serverless adoption, right? And what's stopping you getting there? And then it would give us the feedback loop on, we're not familiar with Dynamo, or we're not familiar with Lambda, or we're not familiar with, then we would go away and think, well, how can we craft a course? Can we send them the serverless land? Here's the pattern. There's lots of ways that we can remove that barrier for them adopting that thing.
So is that what the sort of next, the next section is, the next best action? And serverless was sort of part of that, but I'm conscious some people may think, well, it doesn't have to be serverless. There are plenty of other ways that you could deploy code, and there can be Kubernetes, and there can be containers, and there can be all these other kind of things. Why do you feel that the next best action involves a serverless-first strategy, and how does that fit in with the flywheel?
Well, I mean, there's a really nice. I'm a massive fan of this image. This is from reInvent from a few years ago. It talks about that kind of spectrum, serverless-first spectrum, where you've got kind of, probably less serverless things on the left, like a VM on-prem, some of the on-prem stuff, EC2, etc. And then on the right, the more serverless services like S3, Lambda, etc. And this is a little old, so there's things like some things aren't here yet. You should be starting over on the right with less operational, with less operational burden, we would say, and that really enables you to kind of build faster. You're right; it doesn't have to be serverless, but it's really about. And then usually people find, well, that's okay. I'm keen to use some serverless services, but what else do I need? There's probably some developer enablement that is needed within your pipelines. There's things within your security organization to make it kind of compliant. There are probably specific skills and architectural patterns that you need to put in place. So there's lots of what we would call building blocks and enabling constraints to enable you to work in this manner. And the thing of doing this at an organizational scale, you need to think about those things and go and work with those departments, not make them do things. Work with the departments. Sit down with your security team and figure out how you can make this future work. So it's quite a big organizational ask. But once you set up all those kind of, I'd say, supporting capabilities, then your team can have the autonomy to kind of go fast. That makes sense.
Yeah. And we said it's serverless first, not serverless only. There are lots of compelling fallback options that you can embrace as well. If your pathway to value is not paved yet for serverless first, maybe it's okay to fall back to Fargate, right? Yep. For your context, and that's why it's really good to have that clarity of purpose and have those North Stars and those North Star metrics. So then you can have an informed conversation about, hey, we need to deliver this tomorrow. We can't wait for a pattern to be available in our stack. So what we're trying to say here is at least have the conversation. Why can you not be more serverless? Why can you not embrace these capabilities? And if you can't, fall back to some of these other ones, but give us that feedback so that we can smooth that pathway for all the reasons, lower cost, pay for what you use, lower operational toil and burden, enhanced security, all the sort of reasons why everyone is trying to embrace serverless, right?
Yeah.
So the big idea is that you are trying to offload as much undifferentiated heavy lifting, which is the sort of AWS term, onto the cloud provider, and in a way so you can focus on the stuff that you need to do. And so it's serverless first, not serverless only, as you said, Mark. And so if there is a service that you can use, try it out. If it doesn't work, there are plenty of fallback options.
Yep.
And then sort of when you're evolving it, because we're talking about sort of enterprise adoption and making serverless successful in a larger scale, there has been this thing probably over the sort of 10, 15 years of, with all this tools and proliferation and cloud, that developers can just go for it. They can code in any language they want to. They can use any tools they need. They can just spin up a function or a container or a service, an API, a messaging thing, whatever, and just do what they want. But there's obviously a bit of a responsibility there, because in a big organization it can't be everyone can do anything they want to do. So how does that sort of fit in? Is this the sort of, instead of development being the sort of wild teenagers that can go nuts and just use any tool in the toolbox, organizations need to evolve slightly more to have it curated? How does that work?
Yeah, I would be trying to answer that question by saying that serverless is fairly opinionated, particularly if you talk about AWS, so the service is all indirect, they're all interoperable, it's event oriented. So there's far less decisions for an engineering team to make when it comes to things like, well, what container should we use? How should we scale it? What framework should we put into that container? So it is aimed at, okay, let's focus on the business value. Let's get something out quickly. Now, there will be requirements that emerge that may move us out of serverless and that spectrum where we do have to go down that route. But those should be looked at, and those should be sort of, architectural considerations. If we did need to invest, say, in something CUTS related or an additional framework. So serverless just helps us focus on the core, moving fast, help teams make, good decisions, but less decisions, but also empowering them with a lot of the, like a lot of these serverless services they're enterprise patterns. They're really in behind those services, so you're able to do an awful lot with them. And I kind of find it's harder once you're up and running in this space. Those use cases become fewer and far between in my experience, where you do kind of move out of it. I don't know, Mark, Dave, if that's.
Well, it's funny. It's enterprise is sometimes a bad word for being slow, but I mean, certainly like for us, I remember talking about removing undifferentiated heavy lifting long before we even knew anything about AWS. I mean, about 15 years ago. So we always had that goal. How can we make it as simple as possible for engineering teams to go fast? And you need to be very opinionated about your environment. I know, Mark, there's probably a big bit around some of the how you set up your accounts and stuff, but I want to just touch on this briefly. This is something we put together about 6 years ago. And what we tried to phrase for a team, what's our expectation for teams, for engineering teams or product teams? And we talked about this idea of a high performance serverless first team. And there's a lot of depth behind these that, you'd be very clear in your business outcome. Security is job number one, high deployment frequency, decent kind of reliability, rent reuse first with build as final option. And trying to tell engineers not to build is a difficult conversation. Really sit on cost, know how much your stack costs and be aware of it, be able to predict it and track it. Focus on event driven. Again, remember this is 6 years ago, so be API and event driven, and then have a decent bounded context. Don't go kind of nuts building kind of all over the place. Keep a nice kind of domain. So that kind of forces you down some paths, kind of trying to encourage teams to go that direction. Which that did work. It did give, and as well, a secondary benefit of this is to make sure that the leadership, both engineering and product leadership, understand what the teams are for and don't try and overload them with things that shouldn't be their concern.
Yeah, Zach Jones Noel has come back. In enterprises, folks would want to adapt serverless, but their only worries about security, distributive teams owning different aspects, infra deployment, testing, staging, whatever. So does this sort of lead into, well, the developers can do anything, but we want to help? Well, first of all, want to help them out. It's not about constraining them. And does this sort of help? Is what some of you positing is sort of having a sort of platform enablement, some sort of platform team that is going to provide some of these baseline building blocks that then individual developers or individual developer teams can, grab an API and grab an authorizer and, something and assemble things more quickly.
I think we're moving into, I'll let Mark hit this, but we're moving into a maturity stage here. This is becoming the next hill, I think, within big companies. We're no longer splitting teams up by function. We're giving team a purpose to build it, run it, own it, and that's a big part of this. That's a massive change that's happening. Mark.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is how can you enable that feature, right? You got to have guardrails and enabling constraints in your ecosystem. So, like, we're big fans of adopting a multi-account strategy, right? Service control policies, AWS config for some of that, remediation. But even from a developer point of view, you want to get in that fast feedback loop around, well, how well architected are you? So, CFN Lint, CFN NAG, other IAC vendors, Sneak and others have some feedback loops that'll give you rapid feedback in your IDE and when you deploy and in your pipelines on the security, the cost, the tagging, all the sort of things that you want to be concerned about. I think, and that might be Mike touching this, what you need to do is continuously educate and continuously inform teams about what good looks like. And that's where the SCORP sort of process come in, about making well architected a really collaborative, facilitated team activity to help make sure that all teams, even though they're going fast, are taking care of those important enterprise sort of responsibilities, right?
So is that part of the last sort of, but the long-term value is the sort of not just scaling it in terms of throughput and that kind of thing, but sort of having a long-term look at how your applications work. And you were mentioning SCORP. I know that's part of the well-architected. Do you want to just mention what that is?
Yeah, it's kind of one of these things, Julian, where I think back when we started working with teams and running well-architected reviews with teams, you find that teams that are moving fast, they'll run the well-architected review, and then you maybe come back a month later, and it's hard for them to progress on some of the findings or do some of the refactorings. So with this SCORP process, what we defined was kind of mix it in a wee bit with the sociotechnical side and limiting cognitive burden and kind of trying to surface a lot of that stuff. We thought we would run well-architected reviews, but we would take the outcomes, and any actions or any things we wanted to improve it, and we'd meet more frequently. So we typically meet, on a per sprint, on a per month basis, and we'd just look at how the team's performing. If the team needed a wee bit of capacity or a wee bit of time to maybe invest in like an enabling capability or to go and do a bit of investigation or work with AWS on something, we'd make sure that happened, and just make sure the team is, factoring all that well-architected goodness and guidance into their day-to-day. And SCORP is also aimed at, we kind of find that I like doing that across multiple teams, so instead of doing it on a per team level, we would have our SCORP reviews where we'd maybe look at the team API, so that's all their dashboards, how they're doing, their backlogs, their workloads, and we'd share and would learn across the multiple teams, so if you solve the problem once, then we communicate it across the other squads, and then everyone kind of gets the benefit. So we look at SCORP as that well-architected continuous improvement vehicle and process for organizations wanting to, rapidly kind of adopt serverless within their space.
And the SCORP acronym, that is the well-architected pillars.
It is.
You're looking at part of the well-architected.
Yeah, I wish I could have come up with something, way more cool or whatever. But SCORP, I always used to say SCORP was it's so bad it'll stick in your head, and people will know what it means. So, but yeah, you start off slow. I used to get teams just doing the basics, writing key things in wiki pages, stuff like that.
Yep.
start off really basic, and then before you know it, you cover a lot of ground very, very quick. And if you can do that as a team or as a group, it's way more rewarding an exercise both for the team and for the organization.
Yeah, and again, don't try and think up your own best practices. Just go and read the well-architected framework.
Yeah. And I know there's a last point there about the the infra teams, and that is something that does come up, in relation to giving up control. But this is where we as engineering teams have to work and say, right, well, we always say if we're going to release a pattern, it's a well-architected pattern, so it meets all the security, the costs, the reliability, the performance kind of controls. We would set at an org level, so the team is then responsible for implementing that, and then we would have controls for detecting maybe when a team is maybe a change has got out that maybe shouldn't have, or protecting the organization, protecting the account. But then also we're enabling our teams, so our teams can make those decisions. So that's a symbiosis. That's something you also got to involve as well, and that is a journey in itself. It's probably a longer conversation, but yeah, I think there's that responsibility on the team that well architected is looking after the workload, but also looking after the organization as well.
That's all to speed things up, because if somebody's building something and there's a well-architected component they can use, or big borrowable steel within your organization, that's obviously going to be really quick to implement.
Yeah, and a lot of it's around long-term value and sustainability. Can this team continue sustainably into the future? So the more they invest in this stuff, the less firefighting they're doing in 2 or 3 months' time, because they have got the dashboards, they have the runbooks, the playbooks, the alarms, the alerts, their pathway to production, and they're consistently and continuously looking at these things. So there's not going to be some 2 a.m. call for, hey, this is all down, and you don't have the runbooks, you don't have your playbook, you don't have your dashboard.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing, because we obviously talk a lot about the DevOps and how that is evolved. And, a lot of DevOps in the real world is still, there are development functions and there are operational functions. And sometimes even within the same team, they're going to be people who focus on either part of that. But part of this is actually, if you can codify some of those operational constructs, like your dashboards and your alerting and everything, your developers can just use the operations part in a much easier way.
Yeah, and that's where those patterns come up, right? Get them up.
I would even say as part of the process of the book. I mean, I like the book is published by IT Revolution, who's run by Gene Kim, who's like we're going to call him the father of DevOps. But I sat and talked to Gene Kim about this and about how the Serverless-First will contribute to DevOps, and Serverless-First is a very pure definition of DevOps. DevOps isn't a person who writes Terraform. DevOps is kind of like it's a mindset. It's a way that we work within organizations, and Serverless-First is a very pure definition of that. So, I mean, part of the audience that we've been working in is the DevOps Enterprise Summit in that community, and I can tell you, from a community of DevOps leaders, they are fully embraced and behind that concept of Serverless-First, which for me is brilliant. It goes away from that thought of infrastructure,
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Our time is unfortunately heading to a short end. Just before we do say goodbye, we were talking about all snippets, and obviously we wanting to write less code when we do serverless, but there's a lot of stuff on these 4 things on serverlessland.com, which has literally got a whole bunch of cool templates and patterns that you can pick as well. And obviously Serverless Land, everything about serverless on AWS. Michael, Dave, Mark, super interesting conversation. I really encourage people to get the book. Thanks for joining us on Serverless Office Hours. And yeah, if you really want to scale serverless in your organization, or even convince your business leaders or your architects or your other developers why this whole journey may be useful, there's lots of great insights that you've written down. So we appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Julian. Thanks, everyone.
Excellent. Well, enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. And we'll be same time, same place next week. The funny time zones continue.